Now we are going to discuss one of the most important skills a historian can develop, and that is sourcing and situation. In this skill, we need to analyze the sourcing and situation of primary and secondary sources. In other words, how did these sources come to be, and then what sort of situation were they composed in? You may remember from middle school or maybe one of your language arts classes the difference between primary and secondary sources, but I have it here on the screen for you if you need a refresher. Primary sources are contemporary accounts and original documents. Contemporary means that it's happening really at the same time as something else. So if a diary or a letter is written at a time when somebody's experiencing an event, that would be considered a primary source. Journals, speeches, newspaper articles that are not looking back on something that happened long ago, but are talking about something that is in the news at the time they are published. This could also be non-visual sources like photographs, audio recordings, video recordings, all sorts of theatrical works would count as primary sources. Secondary sources use primary sources to try to draw conclusions about what actually happened in the past. And so they might take a look at a variety of primary sources and evaluate them, consider biases, and then they might also look at other secondary sources and scholarship surrounding a historical event, and then try to draw some conclusions. A great example of this would be your textbook. That is a secondary source, though you will find primary sources excerpted inside of it. In class, we'll talk about the sort of benefits and drawbacks to primary and secondary sources. But really, you need to keep in mind that primary sources and secondary sources are both necessary to have a good study of a historical event or time period. It's helpful to have the first-hand accounts, but sometimes those come with unexplained biases, whether those are explicit or implicit. Secondary sources are great for helping us to develop a larger picture of what happened, but again, you're relying on somebody else's editorial skills to determine what the most important facts are of that event. Anytime we look at a source, whether it is a primary source or a secondary source, we should be asking questions inherently about that source and where it came from to understand the relevance and importance it has in our studies. So first question you'd want to ask yourself is this a primary source or a secondary source? Is this somebody's first-hand contemporary account of what happened, or is this somebody else's interpretation based on a variety of different sources? We always want to consider the author's point of view. So what is it that they are trying to articulate? What is it, their vision? What are they trying to say? It's also important to consider the purpose. Is the author writing a diary for their own personal reflection? Are they writing a letter to try to convince somebody of something? So you really have to think about the purpose of the document, because it might give you a clue about how reliable it is, or maybe even some of the language that they chose. You also want to consider the historical situation surrounding the author's work. This is where your contextualization skills come back into this. So what's going on in the world around them that may have impacted how they're viewing the particular event that they're describing? Who is their audience? Are they trying to convince people, and are they using certain tactics because they are trying to persuade somebody of an idea? What is the significance of the document? How important is that document in history? Does it change our understanding of a time period or an event? And then what are the limitations of a source? And there are limitations to both primary and secondary sources, but what parts of the picture are we not getting with this particular source?